In this video, we're going to examine new allegations and new information related to Dr. Ravi Jayaram and the farcical retrial of Child K. You can see Dr. Jayaram on the screen now doing his relaxed model pose. Now, this has been broken by Lucy Letby, who will be a name familiar to many of you. She runs the Trials with Lucy Letby X.com account, so if you're a person that uses Twitter or X, or however you want to describe it, it's definitely worth following her, as she always comes up with interesting posts and new information, and she's constantly working on breaking new things, so definitely give Lucy a follow. Before I go into the new information, I want to contextualise Child K and the retrial for you. So this was decided, as mentioned here, on the 25th of September 2023, when the Crown Prosecution Service confirmed that there would be a retrial on one of the 6 attempted murder counts on which the original jury had been unable to reach a verdict. This retrial began in June 2024, and ultimately, as we know, Lucy was found guilty, and an extra whole life order was added to her already extraordinary 14 whole life orders. So there has to be a serious question as to why this retrial ever took place, even if the evidence was stronger than it is, and we're going to discuss that as this video continues. Even if the evidence was good for this case, Lucy Letby was facing 14 whole life orders. This case had already been in court, and the jury had not reached a verdict. There was no real need to traumatise the parents all over again and make them go through a second court case. And I would suggest the sole reason that this occurred was because the police and the prosecution were already experiencing criticism, even within weeks of the original verdict, and they wanted to keep people quiet for a little while because they knew the press wouldn't be able to report on this due to contempt of court issues, and there's some Latin name that I've forgotten exactly what it refers to, which just means you can't speak about a court proceeding that's in process. And this meant that the 2 articles you can see on the screen now were delayed. Now, when you consider the amount of stuff that's come out, it's only 2 years since these articles came out, and the extraordinary amount of stuff that's come out since then, all of which points to innocence, and that is despite the fact we had a 6 to 8 month period where the press were held back from reporting, where it's difficult for people to speak about it online, where there were serious contempt of court issues. Can you imagine how quickly things would have happened if this retrial didn't happen and didn't occur? So that is the only justification that I can see for this trial going to court, considering the not even flimsy, non-existent evidence that was used to convict Lucy Letby in this case. Now, another aspect of this is I can't see any conceivable way that Lucy can have a fair trial in the climate that existed at that time, where she was convicted of having killed babies, having harmed babies deliberately. And it was such a massive media story. Now, in the Court of Appeal judgment, where she attempted to appeal or be allowed an appeal on this case, the Court of Appeal judgment and verdict notes this fade factor, which basically means, oh, don't worry, the jury would have been able to forget about it, even though they were reminded of it all the way through the trial by the prosecuting barrister. Now, I must say that the Court of Appeal verdict for the retrial goes beyond the ludicrous into the realm of the surreal. It is truly ridiculous. It is frankly embarrassing that adults wrote it down and pretended that it had merit. It's very obvious that Lucy couldn't get a fair trial for this retrial, and that's reflected in the fact that the jury found her guilty extremely quickly, whereas in the original trial, the jury presided for a very long time and couldn't come to a verdict. Frankly, I don't know why they couldn't come to a verdict, because there was no evidence, and there was no evidence in the retrial. But there was no prospect whatsoever that this was a fair trial frankly, this was another embarrassment. In this overarching national embarrassment, there's the conviction of Lucy Letby. This retrial was a kind of mini embarrassment. So, speaking of no evidence, the conviction in relation to Child K, as conceded by the prosecution, came down to a single issue. Do you believe Dr. Jayaram saying what he saw? Do you believe he's telling the truth about what he saw, which he didn't even see? He didn't even see anything. But you just have to decide, is Dr. Jayaram telling the truth, or is it this murderer who I've said murderer, murderer, murderer all the way through the trial repeatedly? Which one do you believe? And that's the kind of farcical situation that is allowed to happen in court. They all just sat there. The judge sat there, didn't intervene, didn't have any problem, didn't stop Johnson once from saying, Lucy, you murdered this person, then you murdered that person, then you did this, then you did that, all the way through the trial, and didn't stop this debacle from taking place. Now, I don't know why all these things happen in court. I don't know why all these decisions have taken place. I don't know why the RCPCH report is ruled out. I don't know why every judge decision went against Lucy. I don't know why they're all so complacent about this crappy system. But it's very clear that they are. Now, the court system and the criminal justice system continues to be put on a pedestal, and people that work in the apex of that system are paid an extraordinary amount of money, and it appears to me that they tend to have a pretty high opinion of themselves and of the system. Well, let me just say, the system is abysmal. That's very clear. I just listened to Peter Hitchens appearing on Trigonometry, and he was saying, well, he said that Britain's in a terrible state, a very perilous state, which I agree with, but he was critical of the court system, the criminal justice system, and he was right to be critical of it, because it's abysmal. It's absolutely atrocious, and that should be evident to anyone that's looked at this case in any detail, and if it's not evident to you, then you must be stupid. Now, the new revelations about Dr. Jayaram relate to swipe card evidence, swipe card data that was used in the original trial. Now, just to remind people, we already know this was wrong for 9 infants in the case. It was reversed. It wasn't just wrong, it was reversed for 9 infants in the case. Now, you can see this was something that is not contested. It's not that the Crown Prosecution Service contests that. It's not the police contest that. The Crown Prosecution Service just pretends that it doesn't matter. So David Davies here, I'm going to go over David Davies' comments later in the video, but I just want to mention here that he wrote to Sarah Hammond, Chief Crown Prosecutor of Mersey Cheshire CPS, in August 2024, asking for clarification about the errors in the door swipe evidence presented during the first trial. In her response, Sarah Hammond described this as not having a significant impact upon her convictions. Frankly, I find this an extraordinary claim. So if we look at the actual documents that were sent back to David Davis, they mentioned that the CPS conducted a comprehensive review of the evidence presented at trial and concluded that the incorrect door swipe data did not have a significant impact upon the evidence presented by the prosecution in relation to the 7 offences of murder and 7 offences of attempted murder for which Ms. Letby has been convicted. Now, it's completely impossible to say that, and considering the very modest ability that is evident at the Crown Prosecution Service, I wonder how they managed to see through time and travel through the space-time continuum and then reach into the minds of the jurors and then conclude that it didn't have any impact on the trial, when it was an absolutely central facet of the prosecution case. The prosecution case went on and on and on, over and over again, at great length, continually. This was an absolutely central pillar of the entire prosecution case. This person was in this room at this time, then this person came out of this room, then they went into this room. Even just the reversing the data alone invalidates all of that immediately. But there's all the other problems with the swipe card data that we know about. The staircase, the entrances and exits that you don't need to swipe for. There's problems with people walking in behind each other without swiping. Even the prosecution admitted that this is a problem, that the swipe card record is not reliable, and it wasn't intended in the first place to track the movements of staff anyway. But still, despite this, the CPS knows that it had no influence on the jury, even though It was probably the most referred to element of the prosecution case during the trial. And in addition to that, the CPS goes on to say here, this is just the kind of typical bullshit that they come out with. The prosecution case relied upon many strands of evidence, such as expert witnesses, eyewitness accounts of medical professionals, shift patterns and medical records of the treatment of the victims. Yeah, none of which has anything to do with the swipe card data. We're assessing the validity of the swipe card data here. The fact that there were expert witnesses is irrelevant because they didn't compile the swipe card data. The eyewitness accounts are meaningless because they didn't see Lucy Letby do anything wrong, and they're completely unrelated to the swipe card data anyway, as are the shift patterns, as are the medical records of the treatment of the victims. So what you're saying is, we don't need to worry about the swipe card data being incorrect because of these other strands that the prosecution relied on. Just bullshit. Complete bullshit. So, yeah, just to remind you, this comes down, the retrial of Child K comes down to a single issue. Do you believe Dr. Jayaram? Is Dr. Jayaram a reliable witness, or is he not a reliable witness? Now, I'm sure most of you have an opinion on this already, but we're going to go over that in detail in this video, and we're going to see that the reliability of Dr. Jayaram is diminishing pretty rapidly at this stage. Now, of course, one of the reasons that the reliability of Dr. Jayaram is disappearing out of sight completely is this previous email that was again reported on by Lucy some months ago now with David Rose in Unheard. Now, there's I'll read this whole passage out actually. Giving evidence at Letby's retrial, he said that, this is Jayaram, that when he was told that another nurse who had been looking after baby K was going to leave her alone with Letby in order to speak to the infant's parents, he became deeply concerned because we had a number of unusual incidents with babies, and he had noted the association with Lucy Letby being present. This made him feel very uncomfortable, which was why he went to check, finding baby K was desaturating while Letby did nothing to help her. Prosecuting counsel Nick Johnson KC asked Jayaram, "Did you hear any call for help from Lucy Letby?" His answer, no, not at all. The prosecution said that Letby had deliberately dislodged the breathing tube and that Jayaram had caught her virtually red-handed. Later at the Thirlwell inquiry, Jayaram said he wished he had reported the incident at the time. "I lie awake thinking about this. I should have been braver." Yet in his first account of baby K's desaturation, Jayaram wrote that far from going to check baby K because he felt uncomfortable that she was alone with Letby, the real reason was that Letby herself had raised the alarm and asked him for help. Now we're going to talk about that again later, but it's notable that another nurse on the unit said that the alarms were definitely sounded at the time period when Lucy supposedly done this absolutely unfounded thing in relation to child K. So Jayaram set this out in an email to 7 of his colleagues dated the 4th of May 2017. Its timing was significant. The previous July, Letby had been moved to clerical work as a result of concerns raised by Jayaram and other doctors, but she had lodged a grievance for bullying and harassment, and this had been upheld. Now the doctors were hoping to involve the police, who at first had seemed reluctant. Jayaram was commenting on a draft of a report they would shortly send to detectives, asking them to investigate. He was blunt about its purpose, for the police to have their interest piqued. To do this, he suggested, the doctors should highlight explicitly for these cases that Lucy Letby was in attendance and in close proximity to the incubators in those situations we know for a fact she was. He went on to suggest additions to the report about cases with which he had been involved, hopefully more in a stating the facts way than a subjective finger-pointing way. So it's fair of them to include that, but obviously this doesn't look particularly great for Dr. Jayaram. Jayaram's email was not disclosed to the defence before Letby's trials. In other documents seen by Unheard, Cheshire Police and the Crown Prosecution Service state that they only became aware of it in August 2024, 1 month after Letby had been convicted of attempting to murder baby K. However, the documents say it was supplied to the Thirlwell inquiry, but it was not discussed there nor published on its website. We asked the inquiry whether it received the email before or after Letby's retrial, but it refused to comment. So I think we know the answer to that immediately. Obviously, it's after the retrial. So this is obviously quite a grisly situation already, where there's two completely different versions of events, And as I mentioned, there's a nurse on the unit that says the alarms are sounding, and that's consistent with the first version of events. And then suddenly, when Dr. Jayaram decides that the interest of the police needs to be piqued, suddenly a different version of events emerges. That's already extremely bad for him, and Sir David Davis has already written to Cheshire Police requesting Jayaram be investigated for perjury already on the basis of this. So I'm now going to go through some of the problems or some of the farcical elements involved with the retrial of Child K. The first one is that the prosecution used this term that Lucy Letby was caught virtually red-handed. Now, of course, this is a complete nonsense because she was never caught in the act of doing anything. So it may be legitimate to say someone was caught virtually red-handed if they're later have proven to have done the thing in question. But here, they clearly weren't caught red-handed, because if Lucy had been caught red-handed, the prosecution would say that she was caught red-handed. She was never caught red-handed because nothing happened. So they had to introduce this phrase, virtually red-handed. But of course, there was no other evidence that she did anything wrong. So this is just an absolute absurdity. As mentioned here, it has no coherent factual content, virtually cannot manufacture the missing act of catching. It merely disguises an inference or even a suspicion as something close to direct observation. It's tripe, basically. The next thing is there's a remarkable statement here from Nick Johnson, KC. So he made this comment about, we say that in those circumstances the only reasonable thing for a nurse to do would be to call for help or use equipment to breathe for the child. The reason she was desaturating was because the breathing tube had become displaced, and we suggest that the fact Lucy Letby was doing nothing and the alarms weren't sounding was because it was Lucy Letby, the convicted murderer, who had displaced the tube. Now, leaving aside they've got no evidence for the latter assertion, what he's saying here, he makes this comment, we say, so he can't say there is evidence or this is factually correct. This is just some throwaway assertion that's made in court. In actual fact, Lucy was acting in absolutely the correct way. This is extensively covered in my book. But you can ask any nurse, certainly a nurse with neonatal or similar experience, that you go through a period of observation. And not only that, but Lucy was following the official procedure that nurses on the unit are told to follow. So there was nothing else she could possibly do. What else could she possibly do other than follow the procedure and protocol? And I think what happened in court here, again, is ridiculous, absurd and embarrassing, because they sort of had a debate where Nick Johnson tried to accuse her of lying. Now, the court could very easily have factually established that this was the policy and procedure for the Countess of Chester, and they could very easily have got other neonatal nurses in there who would have said, yes, Lucy was doing the right thing, yes, there should be a period of observation, yes, you don't have hands-on care, there's numerous reasons for that, etc., etc. Instead, the court just heard this, and they heard some, litigation and some cross-examination and so forth. They didn't hear any of the facts. Somehow all the facts, even though this retrial was an absolute farce, and if it had been conducted in a remotely fair climate, the prosecution would never have won in a million years. But even leaving that aside, the process was so poor because this could have been countered by actual reality, and as often happens, the court never heard about reality. They just heard all this prosecutor, barrister bullshit that courts tend to hear. Now, for some reason, one of the underlying explanations for this is that the court heard quote-unquote expert evidence from Elizabeth Morgan, a nursing advisory consultant, who disagreed with what Lucy said for some bizarre reason. This is so unsatisfactory on so many levels. In my book, you'll see Michelle Warden talk about Elizabeth Morgan and say, well, she doesn't know what she's talking about, basically. She was someone who was inappropriate to be giving this evidence, really. And then secondly, she didn't appear in court. She was just allowed to give a statement. I can't imagine why she wasn't cross-examined. And then, of course, there's so many people it would have been so much better to comment on this, and yet somehow she was allowed to contradict what Lucy said, even though it's what she said is yet another thing in the court case that's just plain wrong. So the next thing is, it hasn't even been satisfactorily established that the tube was even dislodged. So not only has Lucy Letby not committed the act for which she has received a life sentence, a whole life order, no evidence for that whatsoever, but there's not even any evidence that a tube was even dislodged. All we have is the account of Dr. Jayaram, who's saying, it's not that he confirmed this definitely, just according to his account of events, a tube was dislodged at this time. The next thing is that many people believe, I know nurses have analysed this quite carefully, and again I've covered this in my book, many that have analysed it believe that Lucy wasn't even the nurse that was in the room. She wasn't the designated nurse for the infant, and if you look at the movements of other infants on the unit, it's quite likely that Caroline Oakley was actually the nurse that was stood next to the incubator. Now, we know for a fact that Ravi never directly confronted Lucy about this. That's just a fact. He never mentioned it to anyone. He never even stated that there had been a supposedly deliberate tube extubation until he spoke to the police, which we'll be coming on to shortly. So it's quite possible, this was early in the morning, he could be blurry-eyed. It's quite possible that he simply mistook Caroline Oakley, who apparently looks quite like Lucy, certainly from behind. Now, I don't know what Caroline Oakley looks like. This is just an image on the screen to represent two nurses that look not dissimilar. But certainly quite a few people have analysed this, who are nurses, who understand nursing practice, who have looked at the record of what occurred at the time. Quite a few of them believe that it's likely even that Lucy was mistaken for Caroline Oakley. Or rather, Caroline Oakley was mistaken for Lucy. So the next thing is that Joanne Williams, a nurse on the unit, stated that the alarms were definitely going off at the time this incident occurred, whereas Jayaram couldn't say one way or another. So the fact, and I must say, Joanne Williams was definitive about this. So the fact that she said that indicates that the version of events we mentioned earlier, in which Jayaram stated that he attended because Lucy Letby had called him to the cot side, this makes perfect sense. Lucy raises the alarm, then calls for Dr. Jayaram, as she is required to do, and another nurse says, yes, the alarms were definitely going off. That is if Lucy's actually cot side, because no one else has any recollection of this incident. Lucy doesn't have any recollection of it. None of the other nurses have any recollection of it. It's just in the, shall we say, fertile mind of Dr. Jayaram. So next thing is that the coroner, Nicholas Reinberg, made a specific comment about the type of tubing used and mistakes that were made on the unit with regard to child K. And it's known, and not contested by Dr. Jayaram indeed, that the wrong-sized tube was used on multiple occasions in this court case, including with regard to child K. And this has been cited, this is understood, this is not in any way contested. Of course, this can contribute to an accidental extubation. Accidental extubations are common, they are well understood. There is an enormous amount of academic literature talking about accidental extubations. What was said in court with regard to this infant, that it would be impossible for an extubation to be accidental, and the only possible explanation was that it had been removed deliberately. And this was something Dr. Jayaram doubled down on in later interviews. It's just frankly utterly farcical. And every single, even remotely qualified person who looks at this case knows that this tube can just fall out. And that's what happened here, and that's what happened in Liverpool. With regards to the Liverpool cases that were submitted to the Crown Prosecution Service at a later date, they were quite naturally thrown out. This should have been thrown out. This is an utter farce. So the next thing to mention is that they've already screwed up in this way on this unit in the unfortunate and highly avoidable death of baby Noah Robinson. The inquest into this took place the year that events associated with the indictment actually began. So there were, as noted here in Private Eye, multiple failed and repeated intubations documented for Noah Robinson and other infants, and this is indicative of a unit in which accidental extubations could happen quite easily. Of course, even on a competent unit, accidental extubations still occur, but the fact that we know they struggled and failed with intubations on multiple occasions, including in this tragic case where there was a very obviously avoidable death, indicates that an accidental extubation of a tube at the Countess of Chester shouldn't surprise us. As mentioned here, Dr. Tariq Ali is incredulous that Letby was found guilty of deliberately dislodging baby K's tube, and that anyone could think accidental dislodgement couldn't happen in a child that small, and traumatising the throat of baby N, when in Ali's view, both could be more rationally explained by intubation difficulties. And then finally, Dr. Jayaram supposedly saw Lucy Letby removing a tube, although he didn't, he virtually saw it, but he supposedly was magically aware that this had happened, but he failed to mention this for over 400 days, and coincidentally the first time that he did mention it was in this infamous meeting on the 15th of May 2017 when he spoke with Nigel Wenham and Paul Hughes of Cheshire Police. So for over 400 days, Jayaram has had the opportunity to speak to the Care Quality Commission about this, speak to the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health about this, speak to people internally. They've been through the grievance procedure for Lucy Letby. Could have said during the grievance, well, I saw her extubate a tube deliberately, or I virtually saw that. He's been through how many internal meetings, how many conversations, how many emails have gone back and forth, and he's never once mentioned the extubation of a tube. And yet, at the very beginning of this meeting, immediately, Dr. Jayaram, having sent this email in which he said he'd piqued the interest of the police needed to be piqued, he, for the first time, he mentions the dislodging of this breathing tube. And that's the first time it's ever been mentioned. And then the last thing I'll just mention briefly is that Jayaram was involved in the investigation and involved in the selection of cases. Now, there can be absolutely no defence for this. It's just completely farcical, considering he was the primary accuser of Lucy Letby, and it seems that this supposed extubation was critical in the decision of Cheshire Police to further investigate, and yet he was later described as the golden thread in the investigation, and was, it is admitted, centrally involved in the investigation in the selection of cases for Cheshire Police. So even before the new leaks from Cheshire Police, things already look extremely bad. There's absolutely no evidence for deliberate harm in the case of Child K. Jayaram is facing legitimate and credible perjury allegations that have emanated from Sir David Davis. There are multiple glaring problems with the prosecution case for Child K, as I've just outlined. Cheshire Police have already reversed the door swipe data for this infant and several others in the case, and there are already serious question marks about the involvement of Dr. Jayaram in the investigation. So let's look at the new revelations with regard to Cheshire Police. So this all relates to this leaked interview with Dr. Ravi Jayaram, which took place on the 3rd of April 2024. So this is just shortly before they're building the case now for the retrial. They've been unsuccessful in the original trial. For some reason, a retrial has been ordered on this case. The only possible justification, or not really justification, but an explanation for that is to silence the press. I can't see any other reason for it. It doesn't change the material position of Lucy Letby. It's just upsetting for the parents of Child K. It's a very weak case. It's obviously going to fall apart in the Court of Appeal. There's just no basis for this conviction whatsoever. But they decided to put it through court. As I say, the only reason I can see for that is to silence the press. But Dr. Jayaram's there having a conversation with DC Millins, who's not a character that I've encountered previously, and this gentleman, C.I. Riley, who's Darren Riley, who appears in the infamous Operation Hummingbird YouTube debacle. And Dr. Jayaram is saying, I'm just looking at the swipe card data now to look at the timings. So by this point, they know that they've screwed up the timings on multiple cases, including this one. It was, I suppose I've seen it now, so it was this where it says that Joe Williams left the unit at 3:47. Riley says, yeah. Now that says, so when again, I suppose the only reason I bring this up is if I've written on here, a lot of that says it's leaving. So he's really good with language, as you can tell. Yeah. That actually means coming back. Oh, is that when she comes back? Yeah, we can't change the data. Okay. Now, the only reason they can't change the data is because it's already been in court. So they can't start saying the data's, oh, this is our data now, or anything like that. Now, I'll leave you to reflect on what might have happened if that wasn't the case. And Dr. Jayaram goes, okay. And then Riley says, but we can change the interpretation of it. So one of the things that Cheshire Police have always claimed is that, we considered every possibility. We didn't frame this inquiry, so-called investigation, around Lucy Letby. This provides the very obvious lie to that, because that's exactly what they're doing. They're just framing their interpretation of the data around Lucy Letby. They made a completely different prosecution case in the first trial when they thought the data was one thing, and now they know the data is another thing. They're just going to frame it in a different way that still results in Lucy Letby being guilty. And it's clear that they never considered any other possibilities, they never examined any other avenues that they should have done, and we can reasonably presume that this happened across the case as a whole. There are so many red flags, including but not limited to the fact they included Brewery and Jayaram in the investigation, the way that they treated Lucy in their interactions, that's all on the record, in terms of she'd written to them and they ignored this, and then they arrested her and they never arrested anyone else. It's there in their own public documents, it's there in their own public statements. If we ever saw the logs, or if we ever do see the logs for this case, it will become immediately obvious that they never looked at any other possibilities. They just allowed Brewery and Jayaram to walk in there, and then they provided the dates. I've shown you the circular process before. It's all on the record. It will be there in their official documents, because this bunch of fools and idiots and half-wits could never run an investigation of this complexity. That's why they've made a pig's ear of it, because they're not intelligent people. They're just not. And that's why they've run this farcical shambles that they describe as an investigation. So, yeah, Riley's saying we can change the interpretation of this. So she went out at 3, and we know it's the other way round. So again, I suppose the only question I have in my own mind is, in the medical notes, I'd written that collapse was at 3:50. It looks like Joe left the ward then at 3:11. I do know that the collapse was within 3 minutes of that. So again, I suppose this is the trouble with retrospective documentation. It was probably earlier, so that collapse may well have happened before the morphine. Now looking at the swipe card data, and again, I guess one of the difficult things is in the middle of the night, putting times there, I'd written 3:50. Looking at this, I would say that collapse was probably before 3:50, and in retrospect, I suspect the sequence was we'd actually written up that morphine after dealing with the collapse and that. So basically what Jayaram is willing to do here is just completely change his version of events. So he's saying, oh yeah, actually, what I said in the first court case that I stood by completely, I've now decided that didn't happen at all. Something completely different happened, because it still needs to be Lucy Letby that's guilty. Lucy Letby, when we thought the data was one thing, we had to say this, so that Lucy Letby could still be guilty, and now the data says something else, we need to say something else, so that Lucy Letby could still be guilty. And that's not what a police investigation is supposed to do. But that is what everyone in this police investigation has done. That is what the officers have done, that's what Brewery and Jayaram have done, and that is what the expert witnesses have done. Everything, there has to be, it can't be a collapsed lung, it has to be Lucy Letby smothering an infant. I think this is the key collapse. Oh no, wait a minute, Lucy's in there. Oh, let's use this collapse instead. And so on, and so on, and so on. And that's why you've got so much bullshit in the court case, because they never looked at anything else. They just had a hypothesis, and they retrofitted everything around that. And this is clear, explicit, undeniable evidence that they did that in this case. And that is absolutely not what they should be doing. And that's why, we're going to look at the comments of David Davis in a second, when he made a comment about this, and it was put to Cheshire Police, and it was put to Cheshire Police by newspapers, they said nothing. Because at this point, they can say nothing, and we'll never hear anything from them again on this case. We'll never hear about anything that they've alleged, about these other people they've arrested. We'll never hear from them commenting again. The next time we will hear from Cheshire Police will be when this case collapses. Possibly, they might release a statement when the case is referred to the Court of Appeal. They might say some pathetic thing like, Lucy Letby was found guilty by a jury. That's the kind of crap they come out with. But I'm not even sure they will then. But that would be the only time. So this is what Sir David Davis had to say about this revelation. During Miss Letby's first trial in 2022, the prosecution relied on electronic door swipe records to show which members of staff came in and out of the neonatal unit and when. The prosecution was later forced to admit that records for one of the doors had been misrepresented at the trial. Events recorded as staff leaving the neonatal unit were actually staff arriving onto the unit, and those recorded as arriving were actually leaving. That matters. The swipe data was used to establish which nurses were where at given points in time. The data was therefore vital to the prosecution's case. Because if the timeline relied upon by the prosecution was based on incorrectly labelled data, it could have important implications for individual allegations, as was the case with the allegation concerning baby K, for which Miss Letby was retried in 2024. At the first trial, the prosecution claimed that Jayaram found Lucy Letby standing by baby K's incubator as the baby deteriorated at 3:50 a.m. on the 17th of February 2016. Crucially, they claimed the door swipe record showed that baby K's designated nurse, Joanne Williams, had left the intensive care unit at 3:47 a.m. But this was wrong. The swipe data corrected for the retrial in 2024 instead indicated that Joanne Williams had actually returned to the unit at 3:47 a.m. This meant Lucy Letby was not alone with baby K when they deteriorated in the way originally suggested. I therefore wrote to Sarah Hammond, Chief Crown Prosecutor of Mersey Cheshire Crown Prosecution Service, in August 2024, asking for clarification about the errors in the door swipe evidence presented during the first trial. In her response, Sarah Hammond described this as not having a significant impact upon her convictions. Frankly, I find this an extraordinary claim. After Cheshire Police realised the swipe data used at the first trial had been presented the wrong way round, they interviewed Dr. Ravi Jayaram again. Crucially, this interview took place before Miss Letby's retrial in 2024. During that interview, the officer said to Jayaram, "We can't change the data, but we can change the interpretation of it." Jayaram, upon being confronted with the errors in the swipe data, abandoned the precise timings he had previously given, citing the difficulties of retrospective documentation. Probably should mention here it's not even retrospective. This was recorded at the time. What you're doing now is looking back retrospectively. So we should probably mention that as well. It is deeply troubling to see what appears to be the police and a key witness reshaping the interpretation of the evidence to Lucy Letby's disadvantage in advance of her retrial. It reinforces that the investigation was driven by a fixed theory and a degree of complicity between the police and some of the consultants. So I think it's impossible to disagree with that based on what we know already and based on what we now know from this incident. So David Davis continues, Jayaram's evidence seems to change to fit the prosecution's case. Now, it's being very fair and very careful with language here. I would simply say that it does change, and it does fit the prosecution case as a result of that. I can't see how that can possibly be denied because it's there in black and white. I've previously argued that those apparent inconsistencies should be investigated as potential perjury. I maintain that view. So what I would say about this is that this strengthens the case for perjury to be investigated. This is very strong indication now that Jayaram specifically changed his testimony in court. Of course, we've already got evidence of that. We've already got strong evidence of that. But now there are two separate instances where we have the evidence in black and white. So this is a letter on the screen here that Sir David Davis wrote to Mark Roberts that's publicly available. So he wrote to Mark Roberts saying that there's a clear and concerning discrepancy between Dr. Jayaram's sworn evidence and contemporaneous documentation of the events. This is regarding the email that I discussed earlier in this video. And he goes on to say, the implications of this are serious. The jury in a retrial may have reached its verdict on the basis of misleading or incomplete testimony. So we now know, essentially, they did. They did reach the verdict on the basis of misleading testimony. It's not incomplete, it just completely changed what he said from the first trial because they changed the data and they purposely did this, as we can see in black and white. Given that Dr. Jayaram's statements formed a critical part of the prosecution's case, I believe there is a compelling public interest in determining whether perjury may have been committed. As I've said, that compelling public interest is now greater than it was before, undeniably. I'm therefore, I'm therefore making a formal complaint against Dr. Jayaram. Cheshire Constabulary now has a clear obligation to launch a formal perjury investigation into Dr. Jayaram's testimony, or alternatively confirm whether such an investigation is already underway. So by not commenting, they have not confirmed the investigation is underway, and they also haven't responded to this call to launch a formal perjury investigation. Now, it's up to them to explain why they're not doing that or why they're not responding. This matter goes beyond the outcome of a single trial. It touches on public confidence in the integrity of our criminal justice system, in particular the requirement to tell the truth under oath in court and the duty of full and fair disclosure during a prosecution. I look forward to your response to the above queries. So, as far as I'm aware, there has been no response. Certainly there hasn't been a public response. So, there has already been media articles published on this debacle, calamity, farce, embarrassment, choose your word. And this was one most notably written by Sarah Napton for the Daily Telegraph. Police reshape Letby witness testimony to get round mistake, claims David Davis. Officer told consultant that the interpretation of data used in trial could be changed for the retrial. So I tweeted on this, so I'm going to read you my tweet on this topic. Regarding this important post from @Lucy Letby Trials, there is one important observation and one key question. The obvious observation is that if the police are willing to change their interpretation when the data changes in order to draw the same conclusion and prosecute the same person, this is quite clearly not an objective investigation. We have heard a litany of nonsense in the public commentary of Cheshire Police, and among these statements has been their insistence that they always considered every possibility at the counter to Chester. This new information demonstrates quite clearly that this assertion is untrue. It is undeniable that the retrial of Child K was framed around Lucy Letby. There is no possible argument against this, as it's there in black and white. The obvious question that would emanate from this is, why did this case go to court? There is literally no evidence. Letby is already facing 14 whole life orders. Cheshire Police have, by their own admission, bungled the swipe card data. Building a prosecution case requires them to abandon the case that they put in court the first time round. It's upsetting the parents of the infants for no good reason, and as a result of this, Jayaram has been exposed as, at best, a highly unreliable witness. Why on earth is this in court? It is clear that Cheshire Police have no qualms about wasting public money. That couldn't be clearer after the, for example, hummingbird necklace incident. But this is particularly egregious and embarrassing. This trial, which has produced a palpably unsafe conviction and led to credible calls for the primary witness to be investigated for perjury, cannot feasibly be justified. Another repeated claim from Cheshire Police has been that their thoughts are, first and foremost, always with the parents of the infants. Were their thoughts here primarily with the parents of Child K, who they dragged back into court, manufacturing a new and contrived prosecution case, making them listen to the whole thing all over again, and seemingly traumatising them further? One indeed wonders why Cheshire Police wanted to take this case back to court. Many have suggested that the sole reason for this was to silence criticism that was already emerging and which has since inevitably grown into a resounding cacophony. Indeed, as soon as the retrial of Child K was completed, important articles from the Daily Telegraph and The Guardian were published, articles that were significantly delayed by this utterly unjustified retrial. When this is over, the Cheshire Constabulary must face scrutiny for their founding role in this debacle and national embarrassment. So what we have here is extremely serious, and I should say that I believe there's more to come as well. But it's absolutely clear here that the police, the prosecution, and Dr. Jayaram were willing to frame the evidence and frame the case that they made around the suspect. That is undeniable. If they could possibly deny that, they would have commented directly but they can't. What they're probably trying to do is now, probably their entire focus is probably on trying to find out who leaked the information, and they'll probably fail to do that because they can't investigate anything. So you can see on the screen here, there are so many issues here. No evidence of deliberate harm. Already we have these perjury allegations or a request for this case to be investigated for perjury. There are so many glaring problems with the prosecution. It's an absolute joke. Cheshire Police have already reversed the door swipe data. There are serious question marks about the involvement of Jayaram in this investigation. It's now clear in this case that they allowed and even encouraged the interpretation of data to be changed in this case to frame the investigation. And it can't even be described as an investigation. It's a farce. Where's the investigation here? There is no investigation. They just framed the case around Lucy Letby. That's explicit. It's there in black and white. And there's already strong evidence that the case as a whole was focused on Lucy Letby at the exclusion of anyone else. I do believe, and I've said before, I'm absolutely certain that they believe she was guilty. When you see, I believe it's Nicola Evans, speaking outside the court, giving a statement, she's very emotional. She absolutely believes that it's a safe conviction that Lucy Letby is guilty. Now that is due to abject stupidity and incompetence. You can argue this is due to abject stupidity and incompetence, but that is the most generous interpretation of what has occurred here. I'll just mention that in my recently released book, Reasonable Doubt, examining the case of Lucy Letby, there is an entire chapter devoted to Child K, which goes into much more detail. Now, of course, it doesn't include these latest revelations because the book was published before they came out, but there will, at some point in the future, there will be a second edition of this book. I've already got at least 15 things that have happened just in the few weeks since we sent it to the printer. So there will be a second edition at some point, but there is an extremely detailed chapter on Child K that goes into all of the problems with the case, and it is just frankly unbelievable that this was ever allowed to appear in a court case. So I think at the end of this utter debacle and travesty, there is only one question left to answer. And that question is, are you still feeling comfortable, Dr. Jayaram?